Beck and welcome to a November and a December wrap up. I'm combining these 2 months because if you couldn't guess, I've been on recovery from jaw surgery, and so I kind of combined my reading for those 2 months and didn't really get to film stuff while I was in a month's recovery. It's going to take about 3 to 6 months for me to look normal, so expect chipmunk face in all the videos coming up, at least for the beginning of 2022. However, I have a bunch of books to actually talk about this time because my reading's been really up and down, but I'm really proud to say that I have read about 45 books this year, and in addition to that I'm currently reading 2 of them. So I will talk about the things I'm currently reading at the end of this video, but I'm going to jump into the books now that I have read in November. And of course, any reviews that I have, spoiler-free and spoiler, will be linked down below. So really what I'm saying is everything that you want to look at will be linked down below in the description, so go and check that out, including my Goodreads and social media links. So the first book that I finished in November was actually an audiobook, and it was Read On by Brandon Sanderson. This is a novella of the Skyward Flight, so it comes after Starsight and after the novella Sunreach, and I have obviously a separate review for it. It is spoilers. This one I can't tell you the synopsis really because it will obviously spoil Starsight, Skyward and the other novella, but loosely I can say that it developed a lot more of the world building. It had a really cool cataclysmic like ending. It had interesting developments of the side characters, which is predominantly what these novellas follow. They don't follow Spencer, they follow the characters around her to give more breadth to the world. But while that is enjoyable to me, it's also simultaneously a little bit annoying because I want all of this development done canonically in an actual novel, maybe intermingled with Spencer's story, because a lot of the time this book didn't really feel like a Brandon Sanderson novel, and I love Brandon Sanderson. He's usually got very tight pacing and plotting, and I found the pace of the novellas not quite up to what I usually expect from Sanderson, and I believe that's potentially because he collaborated on these novellas, and maybe he's just ironing out his style, maybe he's just figuring out a balance with Jancy Patterson, who co-wrote these novellas with him, or maybe he kind of wrote a rough outline and threw over a lot of control to Jancy, and this is mostly her style, and it's not a style that I particularly vibe with. Either way, I gave this novella a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm really disappointed that I didn't love it more because a lot of Sanderson's work I tend to give a 4 or 5 stars, and it's like top tier rating. 3.5 stars isn't a bad rating either, but it's a rating below what I'd usually rate a Sanderson book, if that makes sense. So I just wish I liked it more, but it's young adult, it's sci-fi. It felt very young adult, and in the past Sanderson has written in the YA space, but it felt more palpable for, say, older readers like myself who don't usually reach for YA but has all of the like development and characters that you would expect to see in a YA. What I'm getting at really is the romance. Sanderson kind of skirts around the edges of romance because it's not really his forte, and I found that his characterization has grown exponentially, like he's gotten a lot better at it. So I go to his work for world-building, characterization, and just plot in general, but I found that the romance really dominated these stories, or these novellas at least, and I don't really go for that thing in a book. So maybe that's partly why my rating is a bit lower, but it also didn't really feel like a Sanderson-paced book. But either way, let me know what you think. I just gave it a 3.5 stars. And I was just happy that I finished it so I could get up to date before Cytonic. And then we continue the disappointing reads of the month with Empire of the Vampire. This was my last Hail Mary of will I like J. Kristoff's writing style, and I honestly think I have outgrown it. This is a book that follows Gabriel, and he's a very bitter man in his 30s, and he's in a jail cell talking to this vampire, and he's a prisoner there and he's forced to tell his story. So it's in a similar format to, say, The Name of the Wind, but The Name of the Wind is one of my favorite books of all time, and the way that this story was told in here, it was told very literally with Gabriel's quotation marks around almost every paragraph, and to me that put a barrier in between me getting super invested and sinking into the world, whereas in Name of the Wind it was very immersive. I found it jarring in this because I could not connect to the story as it was happening. It felt like I was removed. So that was just one of my issues with this. I don't like J. Kristoff's writing style anymore. I really outgrown it. I've done a whole spoiler vlog of I read this book and suffered so that you don't have to, and I go into minute detail about why I disliked this. But ultimately it was just the writing style, it was the pacing and the characters, and the tone of the book was really up and down. So unfortunately I'm going to be unhauling this. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I did not like it. I actually think I hated it. So I'm not reading J. Kristoff anymore. He's not my favorite author anymore. And to be honest, I'm kind of scared to reread Nevernight because I adored the first 2 books in that series, didn't love Dark Dawn very much. And I feel like if I reread that series, I read it in the past at the perfect time for me. And now if I reread it, I think I'll also dislike it just because the way that the tone of the book is very almost arrogant, but that's the kind of characters that he writes. Bitter and arrogant characters. So if you're liking that tone and that vibe and you want a little bit of angst, read this. But I didn't like the drama, the flair and the angst. I wanted more settled and grounded characters. I wanted more interrelationships in here. And I wanted to just be invested more. There were pieces of the world building that I was interested in because it's about like a vampire apocalypse and each nation is divided by rivers because vampires can't cross running water, but then in the winter it all freezes and so it's like a free-for-all. So I like that concept. It sounds amazing. It just went over my head or past me. I didn't like it. So that's pretty unfortunate, but it just is the way it is. Reading is very subjective, so if this is your favorite book, I'm sorry, but I did not like it. And then we have another audiobook and that is by Joe Abercrombie and it's called The Wisdom for Crowds. I finally finished this book. This is a year, 2021, that I read a bunch of books by authors I've read before and I just did not love them as much as my previous books that I've read by them. And this was one of those. Unfortunately, I gave this about a 3 stars, and while I was invested in all of the characters and the plot and pieces of what was going on, the pacing just felt super slow. And I can't say what this is about because this is the last or maybe the 3rd in a quartet. I thought this was the last book in the series, but it felt like middle book syndrome, and maybe that's because there's another book after this, but I just did not care about certain things going on in the plot. The politics, while it was interesting, it just felt very drawn out and very pieced together, and I didn't feel the tension a lot of the time, and there were a lot of characters introduced. So I love Joe Abercrombie's characterization. He writes voice of character really well, so that even when I'm listening to the audiobook or reading his books, he tends to create this visual image in my head that is quite clear. But even though he did that, I didn't care about what was going on. There were a few characters that carried over from his previous books that I was like, oh, I kind of like them. I'm interested, but only vaguely. So that's why it took me months to finish this audiobook, because it was really up and down with my care factor. And I only gave it, I think I said a 3 stars, maybe a 3.5, but I do want to say 3. I'll stick with 3 because it really wasn't as good as the previous 2 books in this series, but maybe I need to reread it so I can rehash all my knowledge. But at the same time, I shouldn't need to do that in order to know who the characters are and the world building, because I know them generally already. So it just is what it is. I didn't love it and I wanted to, and my expectations were clearly too high and it just kind of undershot them. So it is what it is. And now I actually read a book that I said I would read in November, and that is Theft of Swords. This also was an audiobook, and during my recovery, I'm still obviously recovering from jaw surgery, but during like the thick of it, where I couldn't really sleep very well and I'd wake up super early in the morning, I'd just jump on the Switch and play Animal Crossing and I'd listen to audiobooks. And that's what I did here, because this is an audiobook narrated by Tim Gerard Reynolds, and that's the same guy that does Red Rising, and I adore his presentation of Red Rising, and so I really liked his voice in this. And I think that's the reason that I finished this. If it wasn't narrated by him, I wouldn't have finished it. So this really says they killed the king, they pinned it on 2 men, but they chose poorly. It's an awesome premise, and it's about these 2 rogues who are like thieves, and they get framed for the king's murder, and then they have to get out of jail and are framed for it and all that. And so it follows the fallout of those events and how they try and escape from them. And this has books 1 and 2. So that story is concluded quite quickly, and then they leap into like a quest format kind of story in a small town in the next story. And it felt really quick and to the point, and while that is good to keep the pace going, it didn't delve far enough into the characters that I wanted it to. It had really interesting elements to each character, like the main 2, I mean, the thieves, but I didn't care about them. I was interested vaguely, but I wasn't like emotionally invested. And I don't know whether that's just my reading taste or the mood at the moment, because I've really been up and down in my reading, like I've said, or if it was just this book. I feel like it was told very traditionally, like it was more of an older style fantasy that was written more recently, and maybe the continuation of this gets better, maybe it gets tighter with the tension, maybe it develops the characters and fleshes them out more. I'm not sure, but I did like this. I gave it 3 stars. I'm not going to continue though, because I'm just happy that I tried it. I know what all the hype is about now, but it's not a series that I can see myself falling in love with, so another 3 stars. Now, I'm really proud of reading this next book because I didn't think that I'd be able to do it, even though I really wanted to. And I read Dune, and I read this and then simultaneously saw the movie in IMAX, so it was epic. I was sitting in one of the middle rows, and when the spaceships took off, you physically had to look up at the screen in order to see them fly away. So I felt really immersed, and that really complemented the fact that I was reading the book at the time. So I knew before I saw the movie that the movie only covered half of the book, and I didn't look up anything to see where the book and the movie cut off because I didn't want to accidentally spoil myself. So I just read this and roughly stopped halfway and then just hoped for the best. And I cut my reading off literally 2 or 3 scenes before the movie cut off. So I accidentally timed that quite well. I really enjoyed most of what was going on in here. So the first 2/3, really enjoyed. And to describe this, it's really difficult because there's so much politics going on. But essentially, we've got Paul, who is the main character, and he's played by Timothée Chalamet in the movie. We've got Paul, and he is like the anti-chosen one. So behind the scenes, there are a whole bunch of things spanning across time by the Bene Gesserit, which are like sorcerers or witches, and they can sense intention and they can read people very deeply and influence them by telling them what to do. It's like almost a telepathy, empathy kind of thing. It's pretty cool, and it's emulated in the movie with what's called The Voice. And I won't say what scene because that was one of the scenes that gave me chills. But essentially, Paul is the anti-chosen one. He's come a generation too early, and so he's messed up all the Bene Gesserit's plans. So that is partly going on in the political background and the world-building background, and then additionally, Paul and his family have been tasked with ruling Arrakis, which is this desert planet. That's where this is set. And there are the indigenous people that live on Arrakis, and they live out in all the sand dunes, and they survive all of the worm attacks. And the worms are like 300 to 400 meters long. They're massive monsters. And so all these people live somehow in the desert, and this royal family have come to rule them, and they don't know how because they want to control the spice. And the spice is this substance that is renowned in the world, in the galaxy, whatever. So they make a lot of money doing that. So it has all of these elements of like different cultures coming together, of people trying to rule, of betrayal, of magic. It's awesome. And it is a book that was written in like 1965. So, or it was published then at least. And so when I was reading this, I was like, it reads kind of like a classic would. And I don't really like classics very much just because they don't really appeal to me. So when I was reading this, I thought, oh, it reads a bit slow, but that's just because it's like that classic nature. It was written a long time ago. And then it kind of went into those white savior tropes later on. And I don't like that trope at all. So it soured a little bit towards the end for me, but honestly, for its time, it's pretty good. So will I continue? Maybe eventually, because I thought this was a standalone, and it is not. It's like the first in a 6-book series, so my bad, but I do plan on continuing eventually. But it's a series that I know that I'm going to have a lot of mental capacity for, because I've got to push myself through reading it because of that pacing and classic kind of tone to it. So I gave it a 3.75 stars. I couldn't quite give it a 3.5 because I enjoyed it more than other 3.5 reads I've had, but it also wasn't a 4, like it wasn't a new favorite, mostly because of that trope I mentioned. So it was really enjoyable. I'm happy that I read it. I'm really glad I didn't listen to the audiobook because I think that would have confused me a lot with all the terms and stuff, but I'm happy that I read it. So it's not a 3.5, it's a 3.75. And then I listened to another audiobook, and that was The Bone Shard Daughter, and I'm currently listening to the sequel. That is the audiobook that I've got on my currently reading shelf. So this is a story about multiple characters, but it essentially follows political factions and the surrounding islands. So we get the main royal line, and the daughter of that is Lynn, and she's trying to learn bone shard magic. So that is like our centerpiece. And then around her, there are a few other characters. So there's another island, and on that island, there is another royal family of that island, and we follow the daughter of that family as well, and she's also dating another girl who is a commoner, and so there is a disparity there with the commoner's struggles and the privileges of royalty, which is a pretty cool dichotomy to play with. And then we also have another character called Jovis, and he was my favorite character, so that's why I remember his name. But he has lost his wife, like quite literally. She was taken by a ship with blue sails, and he has become a smuggler, and he's got gang backgrounds, so he's had a rough past, and he's just trying to find her and track her down again and try and see whether she's safe or not. So we've got all of these different story factions from different levels of royalty, of non-royalty, of commoner, of smuggler, and all the issues that go with that, as well as bone shard magic. And in addition to that, we have an animal companion with Jovis, whom I love. So it had a couple of tropes in here that I really enjoyed. It had enough spread of characters that it kept things new and interesting, and it kept the pace going as well. And so I really like all the characters in here. I quite liked the pacing, like I said. I like the world building, I like the magic, and in the second book, The Bone Shard Emperor, things have only escalated with the magic and characters have collided, and it's just really great. So I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. At the moment, the second book is about a 3.5 stars, but I'm only just over halfway through, so it has potential to go even higher. And I'm really enjoying this series. This is a young adult fantasy, and I don't generally reach for young adult fantasy, but I've seen a lot of hype about this one, and I knew it had a female-female relationship in it, which is why I was even more interested. I'm really happy that I gave this a 4 stars, because historically I've looked at other people's YouTube channels and I've looked at their recommendations, and sometimes we have crossover taste, and then I've picked stuff up and I haven't loved it. So I'm just glad that I've read this and I've really enjoyed myself. But speaking of not loving stuff, I was reading The Ninth Reign and I DNF'd this, or put it down rather, on page 133. And I'm really disappointed that I didn't love this, but I think it was something to do with the characters and the pacing of this that I just couldn't vibe with. And I talked about this a lot in a weekend reading vlog that I did, so I will link that for you. Obviously it's no spoilers, but what this roughly is about, without you having to watch my vlog, is a couple of different characters. So one of them is named Vin, and she's a woman in her early 40s, and you know that she's been on contracts before, but you're not sure why. And so she is like a scientist. She's also running a vineyard, and she's studying these creatures. That's all I want to say about her. There's another character named Tourmaline, or Tor, and he is from a long line of vampires. They're kind of like vampires. In his culture, the god tree died, and his people previously fed from the sap on it, and that kept them immortal. But because the tree died and the sap therefore ran out, him and his people have had to rely on humans and their blood in order to sustain them. And after a certain point, it differs by every individual. The blood causes people like him to go through the blood plague, and the blood plague could last, you know, a week, or it could last months or years, and it's just your body shutting down gradually. And so he's like, I don't want to stick around and wait for the blood plague to come upon me. I want to get out into the world and do things. So he's like 300 or 400 years old, and he meets up with Vin quite early in the story, and you get the sense that they've worked together before. It's not a romance, it's a partnership, which I quite enjoyed. There's also another faction of kind of like nuns, or this prison for women, and all of these women have some kind of magic that's called winnow fire, and they're not allowed to use it, and you don't know why. They're all kept in this prison because they're very dangerous, or they're deemed to be, and they have no authority and no individuality. And so one of them we follow is called Noon, and I liked the premise of this, right? It sounds awesome, but I just didn't get on board with the writing style, and the writing style and the tone really have to sell me, I've found, otherwise I can't get into it. And that's what happened with this one. I just couldn't get into it. I really did try, but it just wasn't for me. And so it's not a bad book. I don't hate it, but I don't love it. I feel very lukewarm about it. So it's another book that, like The Bone Shard Daughter, I got on a YouTube recommendation, and I just don't vibe with it. So I DNF'd it because I want my reading momentum to not stagnate. And I think if I try and linger on books like I did a lot through this year, then I'm just going to stagnate, and I don't want to do that. So DNF'd at 133 pages. I hope a lot of people, when they see this book on my read list, were very proud of me, because I finally finished Calibans War, which is the second book in the Expanse series, and this really took off after Leviathan Wakes. So regarding the plot, again, I can't say too much, but I will give you a rough synopsis. So we get a few new perspectives in this. One of them is a Marine, and she watches her platoon get slaughtered by a super soldier. In addition to her, we also have a politician who is trying to prevent the end of the world as we know it. And then we've also got problems with the planet Venus, which I can't go into too much. And then in addition to that, we've got Jim Holden and his crew. So we've got a few more moving parts in this, and I think because it really springboarded from the first book, I enjoyed this quite a lot. I gave it a 4 stars, and even though when reading it felt quite long because the writing is very small and it was like a 600-page book, I think I'm just a wuss. I haven't practiced reading, so I have no stamina for longer books at the moment, but I really enjoyed this. I liked the tone of it. I liked all of the characters. I really respected the relationships especially the romances that were brought up in this book, they were handled in a very mature way, and I don't often see that happen. People actually communicated in this, and I'm like, is my bar so low that I need characters to actually communicate? But yes it is, and yes they did, and I'm just happy that they did. I also kind of saw the plot twist coming. Like, there were multiple plot twists obviously, but one of them at the very end, I was like, oh, this thing's gonna happen, and I knew it pretty early on. I don't want to say how early because obviously that might spoil the kind of trajectory of it, but I kind of saw it coming, and even though it was a bit delayed in happening in the book, it wasn't something that was a massive deal breaker for me. It was just something that made me want to read more, and so I went out and bought the next book because now I'm continuing. So wait for this to be on like 8 TBR videos next year. But anyway, I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. I'm really excited to continue in the Expanse series. I'm not watching the show yet because I want to read the books first. So that's the thing now. And now I'm going to end this video on a high because recently, like in that reading vlog that I mentioned, I read a book that was 5 stars, and it's Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. I was not expecting this to be 5 stars, and I'm quite miffed actually that I filmed my best books of 2021 video, and I filmed it before this because I filmed it before my surgery and I read this during my recovery. So now you know, this is great. Go read it. 5 stars. It had so much hype, but I am on board that hype train now and I have no regrets. So this follows a character who has a tragic thing happen to her. So her mother passes away and she finds out that there is a magical secret society at her college. So it's an urban fantasy book. Magic is intrinsically linked to her and she pushes her way into this society, and everything kind of explodes from that point onwards. I really liked all of the characters in this. I loved the main character, I loved the side characters, I loved how this delved into descriptions of Black culture and slavery and grief and just family and friends. I just really liked this book, and it touched on every topic very delicately and very deeply, and I really appreciated everything about it. At the same time, I'm really concerned that this might be potentially setting up a love triangle. I was really worried that that might happen in here because I hate it when characters are like, oh, I love this character, and then all of a sudden there is another character on the scene that they happen to love as well, and it's not really doing that as starkly as I have described it, but I'm just very not optimistic about this kind of thing. So I've pre-ordered the sequel to this, and it comes out in an entire year's time, so I have a lot of time to stew and ponder about what may happen in the sequel. But that aside, I really enjoyed this. Hopefully it doesn't go down that love triangle kind of trope path because I really respect what this book did. I really respect all of the characters. I was constantly thinking about this when I wasn't reading it, and I was like, huh, that's what actually enjoying a book feels like. I haven't felt this for a long time. So I'm just really, really happy that I gave this a 5 stars. And what a way to end this wrap up on. Well, kind of. I do have the 2 books that I'm currently reading, and they're going to be the last 2 books that I end up finishing this year, or maybe I'll finish them early January, who knows, but they won't be obviously in a wrap up for this year, so they'll appear at some point. I just don't know when. So Legendborn, 5 stars, loved it. Go read it if you think it would be your thing, because I didn't think it would be my thing and it turned out to be, so very pleased. And like I said, the last 2 things that I'm currently reading, one is The Bone Shard Emperor, which I talked about the first book before. Can't really talk about the sequel, so I'll just jump into the other book that I'm currently reading, and that is Middle Game by Seanan Maguire. I am 135 pages into this, and it follows twins Roger and Dodger. They are intrinsically linked to alchemy and to each other because they seem to be able to communicate telepathically across different states in America. So it opens with this guy who was created, like literally created by an alchemist, and he's like 100 years old or over 100 years old, and he's trying to find the sweet spot between science and between magic as alchemy, and he thinks he can do that by creating the perfect duo. And so Roger and Dodger, the twins in here, aren't the only siblings that he has created, and it's not the only project that he has been following, but these are the 2 characters that we are experiencing, and I quite like their tone. The story is told from a bit of a timeline, but it's not a timeline that's particularly jarring. It's pretty easy to follow, and these characters' voices are very engaging. Quite like their relationship with each other and their observing of the world. At the same time, Seanan Maguire tends to go into like a more profound kind of writing level where she encaptures the world around her and makes the characters ask existential questions, and sometimes what she's talking about isn't literally what's right there on the page or what's being experienced. And so sometimes I find it a little bit jarring because I deliberately don't read literary fiction because I just don't vibe with it. But Other than that, I'm quite enjoying the story in here. I'm interested to see where the characters end up. It's about a 3.5 stars at the moment. Hopefully it reaches a 4 because I'm only like 135 pages in. It's not very far. So I'm really anticipating that I'll give this a 4 because I ideally would like to also give it a 4 and keep my ratings a little bit higher for the end of the year. But there you go. These are all the things that I read in November and December. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know how many books you read this year. I would be interested to find out. But again, thanks for watching this video. I'll catch you down below and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.